African Americans want land for farming. How did sharecropping affect freed African Americans? Freed African Americans wanted land for farming so that they could establish independence from their former owners. In the late stages of the war, the federal government had sold or leased confiscated. Confiscated means that they took the southern land, confiscated southern lands to many former enslaved people for farming. By 1865, about 20% of the confiscated land was being farmed by freed African Americans. In one example in Mississippi, African American farmers leased plantation land owned by Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his brother. Some of these farmers included formerly enslaved people once owned by Davis. Their cotton crop yielded $159,000 a year in 1865. Okay, so the African Americans, remember when they were freed, they didn't have any land, they didn't have any houses, they didn't have a whole lot of anything. So they wanted land for farming. They knew how to farm because they'd been doing it, but now they needed to do it on their own so that they could be independent. Okay, they didn't want to have to go work for their former owners. So the government had taken or confiscated southern land, and many of the former people who were enslaved, they got to farm that land. Okay, so they were profitable. This cotton crop yielded $159,000 in one year, and in 1865, that was a lot of money. In January 1865, General Sherman issued a field order distributing some of the confiscated lands in South Carolina and Georgia to freed African Americans. However, that summer, President Johnson declared that the land held by the federal government would be returned to its original owners. Okay, so let's remember President Johnson, he's in office because Lincoln was assassinated or killed. Johnson was the vice president, so he stepped up. So the government had given some of the land to the freed slaves to farm, but President Johnson, he said, nope, we're going to take it back and give it back to its original owners. After the war, many southern states passed laws that made it difficult for African Americans to buy or lease land. As a result, freed men were often forced to work for wages, sometimes for the very plantation owners who had held them captive. Some landowners could not afford to pay wages due to the short supply of money following the war. To pay those working the land, they created a system of sharecropping, in which the landowner rents a piece of land to a farmer in exchange for a share of the crop that the farmer grows. The landowner also provides seed and sometimes tools on credit. The sharecropper repays the debt after harvesting and selling his or her crop. Okay, so the southern states, they didn't really want African Americans to buy or have their land, so they made it really hard for them. So these freedmen, they had to work for wages, so work and get paid. So sometimes they ended up working for the plantation owner that used to own them. So, but some of these landowners, after the Civil War in the southern states, they didn't have any money, so they couldn't pay. So they came up with what was called sharecropping. Okay, so sharecropping is when the person who owns the land, so I have a farm, so I'm going to rent it to my brother, and in exchange, whatever he grows, I get a piece of. Okay, so the landowner would also buy the seed and the tools. Okay, so I own the land. I'm gonna say to my brother, here's a piece of the land. You can farm it. Here's some seed. Here's some tools. But when you're done, you have to give me some of the some of the crop that you grow and some of the money from it. Sharecropping frequently drove both landowner and farmer into debt because both had to borrow against the sale of the crop to afford to live. Many More often than not, sharecropping became a cycle of re-enslavement for formerly enslaved African Americans. Landowners took advantage of the poor and illiterate formerly enslaved African Americans who were uneducated in the areas of calculating interest payments and auditing account records. A sharecropper who did not produce enough crops to repay his debt would be forced to borrow again and hope that the following year's crop would be more profitable. Despite its obvious inequities, sharecropping persisted in parts of the South until the 1930s. Okay, so basically, if my brother was not able to to pay me for what I felt he owed me for the land, then it would just continue in a circle and a circle. And basically, he would still be giving me all of his crops to pay me, but he was making no money. So the slaves were kind of still enslaved in that way. Okay, so it really wasn't fair. It wasn't fair to the formerly enslaved people. It was just kind of a way to trick them. They were poor, they were illiterate, which means that they couldn't read. Okay, they weren't educated. So they didn't know how to like calculate interest payments and account and keep track of all the money and all the things. So they were a little bit taken advantage of. Okay, but that did last till the 1930s.